Well, good morning to our Sacred Heart parishioners and those who are with us in Shady Cove or Jacksonville, the greater Medford area. Come to you after returning from the amazing parish conference in Kansas with another thought for the week for your reflection. And I'm entitling this talk, Know Him Well. It's something I'm drawing on, in my mind at least, from the Baltimore Catechism. That's not a catechism I was raised with, by the way. I was born too late for that to be the standard catechism, but I like to remind people that once the church promulgates a catechism, the church has made a statement, it's free of error, it's effective for teaching. And so if you prefer that catechism over the modern one that we have, the more substantial theological work, then you're more than welcome to make use of it. For those who are not familiar with that catechism, it's really a thin text, a kind of a Q&A text made up of a list of commonly asked questions and short answers, and it was meant to be learned by memory, rote instruction. And you can talk to people today in their 60s and 70s and 80s who can still quote accurately those teachings. So on the one hand, it apparently was a very powerful tool, but anyway, the title of my talk is drawn from the first question. I have to paraphrase, so I might not be word for word on what it teaches, but essentially the first question is, why did God make me? The purpose of my life. And the answer is to know, love, and serve God in this life so that I can be with Him forever in the next, in heaven. To know, love, and serve God. 6 words. But for the person today who stumbles around searching for the purpose of their life and who can't find meaning, that powerful answer is a key if people would take it to heart. To know, love, and serve. That will lead us to our fulfillment. I'm familiar with that phrase. I've heard it for many, many years. But I came across a very interesting homily on YouTube last year during the pandemic. It was given by a priest about my age from somewhere in Texas. And he chose to preach on that simple phrase, to know, love, and serve God. He spoke about it in a way that I hadn't really ever thought of before. He said, those words are not randomly listed like some kind of stew. You couldn't change the order of them because you can't have the second item on the list until you've first established the first, and you can't get to the third until you have those first 2 in place. And the way he explained them was in reverse order. He said, in considering this knowing, loving, and serving God, you cannot serve a God that you don't love, first of all. That goes back to something that I've been speaking on for the last 2 months, something from the Search video series that we saw, where Chris Stefanik said that if you remove the love story from a marriage, all you're left with is a to-do list, just a list of duties. Make sure to pick up milk at the grocery store, and don't forget to pick up the kids from soccer practice, and where are you, why are you late coming home, etc., etc. If your marriage becomes simply a to-do list of duties and it becomes an empty thing, in most cases, those kinds of marriages don't last. It's not sustainable. And in the same way, sadly, people often let their faith life move in the same direction. That if you remove the love story from our faith, then you're left with a to-do list. Someone who simply says, I have to go to church on Sunday because it's my duty. I have to go to confession at least once a year in Easter time because it's my duty, etc., etc., etc. A list of rules and regulations. But with no love, with no heart, it's empty. It's no mystery why we are seeing people leaving the faith in great numbers. My suspicion is that these are people who were introduced to the faith as a list of chores, as a duty, and were never taught the love story, or perhaps having once learned it, forgot it for some reason. But duty is not sustainable. Love is. So I would not give my life to be a priest if I didn't first love the Lord. But before we can love the Lord, if you go back a further step, you have to first know Him. those things follow. If I don't know God even exists, how could I love him? Why would I even have the inclination to think about it? And if I don't know our God as a good God, worthy of love, why would I ever arrive at loving him? So consider this. I bring this up because I want to speak to you about spiritual warfare 101. We have an enemy, first of all. He's real. His name is Satan. He is a creature like you and I, and he is a defeated creature. So the victory's already been won. However, if you want to describe Satan's existence currently in a short way, it would be this: misery loves company. Satan was a fool as a creature when he tried to take on the Creator. It was no match from the beginning. He can't harm God. So instead, he tries to harm the next closest thing, us, who were made in God's image and likeness. And he is envious of us because God chose humanity for the incarnation rather than the angels. And so he puts forth all of his energy to try and undo our salvation. If he can bring down any one of us, it brings him some satisfaction. And it's important to know that although Satan is not wise, he is clever. He's not wise because he's not a friend of God, but he is clever in his tactics. And from his perspective, if you can think for a second, Satan doesn't want disciples. Satan doesn't want the Christian faith to grow. So what is the most efficient, what is the cleverest way to try to undo the progress of the church? Well, if you take a close look at the formula I just described, if you don't want people to serve the Lord and you don't want people to fall in love with the Lord, the best thing is to go back to the beginning of the formula and offer people a deformed image of God, to offer them a lie. Satan is a very skilled liar. He's the father of lies. And so if he can offer us an unattractive or an untrue image of God, that would prevent us from loving him. Or if we fell in love with a lie, then it would cause us to do evil or harm in the world, but it would bring damage. So let's take a look at some of the ways in which we get the image of God wrong and therefore interrupt that process of falling in love with the Lord and offering our life to him in service the way that God wants us to. One simple example, a kind of a funny example, I'll take from C.S. Lewis in his book, Mere Christianity. I'm reaching the tail end of that as I read it. It's based on a series of radio talks he gave. He labels the components of the book as 4 separate books. We might call them sections, but I'm right now in section 3 that he calls the 3rd book. And he begins this section describing a conversation he had with a child in England once. He asked the child, "How do you imagine God? How do you see him?" And the child gave a very honest but kind of funny and cynical answer. He said, "Well, I think God is the person who watches us from afar and who tries to make sure that none of us ever has any fun." That's what he said. And he went on further to say, when God notices we are starting to have fun, he comes in and squashes it. That was God to this young man. Can you love that God? That false God? God the killjoy? God the one who desires to wipe all fun from the earth? I can't. I wouldn't be here today if that's who I thought God was. But that's how Satan works. If he could plant that in your mind and say, all people of faith, all Christians, they're just serious fuddy-duddies. They're no fun to be around. It's not true. Or if it is true in some small cases, shame on us. If we're not living our faith joyfully, the surest sign of a vocation is joy. Jesus said, I came that they might have joy and that they might know it to the full. I believe God is joyful and we're made in his image and likeness. But that's one way in which that process of discipleship can be interrupted. Here's another one. It has been said in the past by someone wise that in the very beginning, in Genesis, God made us in his own image and likeness, and that ever since then we've been trying to return the favor. In other words, trying to make God in our human image a lesser God. This is so sad when it happened. And by the way, we're not even very fair when we do this, when we're guilty of this. It would be one thing if we took the best examples of humanity, somebody like, say, Mother Teresa of Calcutta or Pope John Paul II, and say, God must be like that, but a million times greater. St. Thomas Aquinas would say, God's not a million times greater. He's infinitely greater than that. That even the best humans have more in common with a rock than with God, because he's creator, not creature, and he's perfect, and we are far from it. But at least we would be trying to give him our fairest shake if we drew an image up from the saints. But that's not what many people tend to do. Instead, for those perhaps who were not blessed to grow up in a loving home, they often use a cruel or a judgmental or a hot-tempered parent to form their image of God. God the judge, the gotcha God who's going to get you, the God who holds grudges, or you had some kind of a horrible experience with an authoritarian figure in your life. Many people create in their mind a deformed image of God from the authoritarian figures in their life. This is also a lie. A cold and prickly, standoffish God is not who our God is. God is love. God is not just the divine person who loves. He is so much love that it is who he is. God is love. And mercy is just another name for love. That's another lie that we sometimes accept, and therefore it stunts our growth potentially as Christians. Here's another one. It just turns out providentially that we're starting a new series in our parish this week on Wednesdays called Metanoia. It's for the one who's been searching for God and who's already found him to some degree, but who wants to deepen their relationship with the Lord. And so each episode of this series is based around a central and important question. And providentially, what is the first question after my homily this weekend? It is, who do you say that I am? It's based around the scene of Peter and the other disciples in Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus turns to them and says, who do the people say that I am? Well, they think you're a prophet, or John the Baptist come back from the dead, or we know from other parts of Scripture that many people think he's some kind of politician or some kind of king, a new dynasty that he will establish in a political sense. But Peter gives a different answer, and we all ultimately have to give our own answer. No one can answer for us. But throughout the series, they interview people, and there's one couple near the end of the first episode. They interview a woman, describes herself as a lifelong Catholic. Apparently, the man she married, her husband, did not grow up with any kind of faith, but he joined the church, I think in part to make her happy, and it's kind of part of their process of getting married. She said that she had this false understanding that she always had a strong, established faith, but a crisis came to their marriage that revealed actually that her husband had a much stronger faith than she had. And when the time of testing came in her life, she crumbled and fell. And she said she realized that up until that point, her image of God was Santa Claus, or as I like to say, Amazon Prime. If your image of God is simply the one that you give your shopping list to, these are my wishes, these are the things I want done, can you fall in love with customer service, even if it's good customer service? Would I give my life in service to Amazon Prime or Santa Claus? No, I can't do it. So that's insufficient as well. God is not there to be our servant. He loves us. He wants to bless us with his bounty, but that is not his central purpose of existence. So that is a flawed image as well. And by the way, one series I want to recommend to people to see on streaming is called The Chosen. Yes, it's based on creative license, shall we say, but it's wonderfully made. It's a story of the life of Jesus and his interaction with various people and with the apostles. I think it's in season 2 right now. Wonderfully done. But I saw a clip this week that sort of illustrates this problem perhaps how it could have happened among some of the apostles, plausible anyway. This particular scene I saw was of Simon the Zealot. And he's coming to Jesus presenting himself. And it's clear from his words that Simon, at least as this director perceives him, that Simon sees Jesus as a future king or a politician, a military general, something like that, a VIP who will kick the Romans out of Israel. And he presents himself proudly. He says, Jesus, I'm ready to serve you. I have strength and I have courage and I'm trained. I can protect you. I'm ready. And he even points down to his belt. He said, I even purchased a new sword. Look at this. And Jesus is smiling at him. And he says, well, it's quite impressive. Very nice. May I have a closer look at it? And Simon proudly pulls it out of his sheath and he presents it to Jesus to look at. And Jesus holds it up and says, fine example of craftsmanship. Truly a wonderful sword. And then with the smile still on his face, he throws the sword into the Sea of Galilee. And Simon is standing there dejected, kind of nonplussed, like what just happened? And Jesus says to him in a pleasant way, Simon, I do not need your sword. It's not the kind of work I've come to do. And Simon starts to look sad and he says, if you do not need my sword, then perhaps you do not need me. And Jesus says to him, Simon, I don't need you. I want you. And he came up to him and he placed his hand on his chest over his heart, as though to say, I want your heart. I don't need your protection. I don't need a bodyguard. I want your friendship. I want your love. So that's an example of a deformed image, even of the Word incarnate, where he has to overcome it. That leads to Simon having a love for Jesus, and ultimately it leads to him wanting to serve him in the proper way as an apostle. There are more serious examples of deformation, though. Why I've chosen this message for this week. Two in particular that we can find in our first reading, which comes from Wisdom chapter 1. And they're these. And that's a heavy thing, but when I'm in ministry, and very often I'll come across people who've been away from God or away from the church for 10, 20, or 30 years or longer even. And they're at a point, at a fork in the road, where they come back to revisit a conversation, and they're trying to find some spiritual sense to their life or rediscover proper purpose, because they realize something's lacking in their life. And I often ask them, why did you leave God? Why did you lose your faith, do you think? This is really often the answer. Someone will say, well, something like this. When I was a child, my father had cancer, and I prayed for his healing, and I prayed really hard as a kid for a long time, for months, and my father died anyway. And the person concluded in their childlike mind, well, God doesn't care about me, or God doesn't listen to prayer, or God doesn't listen to my prayer, or worst of all, there's no one there. I'm talking to thin air. I don't believe any longer. What they've really done is they are accusing God of killing their father in this case, or worse yet, and more painful, when a parent loses a child and has tried to pray through that for strength and for a miracle, for healing, and it didn't come. And so the person concludes, God is a murderer. God took someone I care about, took them out of my life, took them away, stole them from me. So they have resentment to God, and they're holding a grudge. That is not who God is. Listen to the first words of Wisdom chapter 1 from verse 13. God did not make death. God is not a killer. It says further on, he fashioned all things that they might have being. In other words, he created all things that they might have life in them. Our God is the God of life. It's why our church is radically pro-life. God made all things that they might live. Who is the one who brought death into the world? Well, the last line of today's reading tells us, but by the envy of the devil, death entered the world. Two things happened that we can place the blame on Satan, the liar and murderer from the beginning. He brought death into the world and he brought sin into the world when he tempted Adam and Eve. Those are the two things that still sort of have chains on us. We continue to sin. We do the things we do not want to do, as St. Paul says, and death is unavoidable. It's the great equalizer. Whether you're rich or poor or a good person or a not so good person, death awaits us all because the wages of sin are death. But God repaired that situation by sending his son Jesus to die on the cross for us, to wipe away our sin ultimately and to bring us back to eternal life, so that when we physically die, when our body undergoes death, we will eventually experience immortality. Our glorified body will be reunited with our soul, which is immortal. That's God. He created us to live for life. So God is not a murderer. If you hold some kind of painful grudge against God for taking someone you care about away from you, that's not God. Here's another one. It says, nor does he rejoice in the destruction of the living. What does that refer to? In my view, this is the person who is convinced God is out to get me. Just as often as I meet this first kind of person who's angry at God because someone they love died, I also meet people who say, well, my house just burned down, maybe in the Alameda fire, or I got laid off of work, or I just found out I have some kind of illness, or, my child just committed suicide, or this or that kind of thing. I just had a miscarriage. And they conclude in their head in a twisted way, it must be because of X, Y, or Z I did when I was younger. Some terrible sin that I've never forgiven myself for, let alone ask God to forgive me, and I think God is getting even with me now. That is creating a God in our image. Our God is not that petty. Our God, again, is loving and merciful. He desires to welcome us back. Furthermore, to take it to the furthest extent, some people say, how can there be a loving and merciful God if hell exists? Our church says that the gates of hell are locked from the inside. God doesn't send anybody to hell. We send ourselves if we choose to go there. When we say, I don't want you in my life, Lord. I don't want you to be a part of my life. He respects our free will. It's the most tragic decision ever, but God does not desire anybody to be in hell. He desires us to be with him joyfully for all eternity. These are all deformed images. And furthermore, let me add one last one. Some people say, okay, because there's COVID-19 in the world, the pandemic, or because there's this war or this problem or that problem, there must not be a God, or our God doesn't care. He's a petty and small God who doesn't ever want to help us. That's also a false image. To go back to the search program we were on, a very wise statement was made there. It says right in this passage of wisdom, too, about this, that everything that God created, he pronounced good. The world that God made was good. Every aspect of it, good. We are not currently living in the world God has made, according to Chris Stefanik. Because if you can look around and see problems and see things about the world that you don't like, that's evidence of that. What God made was good. We are not living in the world God has made. We are living in the world we have made of what God has made. Point out any kind of a problem. If we have climate problems, if we have disease problems, these are things we've done. We smoke, we overeat, we invent artificial additives and preservatives and other artificial things. We create diseases. We've created these problems globally with pollution. We make wars with our own sin, with our own evil. All these kinds of terrible things that we look around and we're saddened and disturbed by, We need only look in the mirror for the source of them. Either we individually or we collectively as a human race were the ones who brought those things into the world, with Satan kind of leading us along or pushing us along. That's not the world God's made. God made us to thrive. God made us for eternal life and divinization. So that's something I want people to take to heart this week, to reflect on. If you have a deformed image of God, you will never fall in love with him properly, and therefore you'll never come to serve him as a disciple passionately with your whole heart as he calls you to do. Let's get that image right. And if you understand what I'm saying, if you currently have a healthy image, help me when you encounter people who have a deformed image of him. There are so many around us. Some of them might come to believe in a different image if they see us live joyfully and live well. But I think that is part of the work that we share as missionaries, as evangelists. So we just pray, Lord, help us to have a correct and true and holy understanding of who you are as God, so that we might really be drawn in to love you with all of our being and give our lives to you in service. That's a God I'm willing to serve. That's a God I've chosen to serve as a Catholic priest. You as a disciple, perhaps you can arrive at that same joyful place. I hope you can. It's my prayer for you. God bless you this week. Tune in next week for another reflection.